The night Callum showed up at her cafe with a diamond on someone else's finger, Waverly didn't cry. She almost did. The tears were right there, sitting at the back of her throat the way they always did when she was caught off guard. But she swallowed them down, along with the rest of her coffee, and smiled like she'd been practicing smiling her whole life, because she had. Waverly. He said her name the same way he always had, like it was something ordinary, like she was someone he used to know and had mostly forgotten about. Callum. She set down the portafilter and wiped her hands on her apron. Behind her, the espresso machine hissed. I didn't know you were back in Vancouver, just for a few weeks. He glanced around the cafe. Her cafe, the one she'd built from nothing after he left. The one with the exposed brick and the mismatched chairs and the line out the door every Saturday morning. This place is yours? It is, he looked almost surprised. That stung more than it should have. The woman beside him was young, maybe 24, with the kind of effortless beauty that made Waverly suddenly very aware of the flower on her sleeve and the fact that she hadn't slept more than 5 hours in 3 nights. She was holding a coffee from somewhere else, which felt like a small, pointed insult. This is Brianna, Callum said. My fiancée, Brianna smiled. She had perfect teeth. Congratulations, Waverly said, and she meant it in the way that you mean things when you're holding yourself together with both hands and sheer force of will. What can I get you? That was 3 weeks ago. She hadn't thought about it much since. Or she'd tried not to anyway. There was enough to think about. There was always enough to think about when you were 34 and running a business and raising a 6-year-old on your own and trying to remember the last time you'd done something just for yourself, something that didn't involve a school pickup or a supplier invoice or a staff schedule. Her daughter's name was Olive, and Olive was the single best thing that had ever happened to Waverly, and also the reason Waverly hadn't fallen apart when Callum left. Because you couldn't fall apart when someone needed you that completely. Olive had his eyes, which was the universe's particular cruelty, but she had Waverly's mouth and Waverly's stubbornness, and she had recently decided that her favorite word was actually, and used it to begin approximately 40% of her sentences. Actually, I don't think dinosaurs were scary, she'd told Waverly that morning, very seriously, over scrambled eggs. I think they were just misunderstood. I think you might be right, Waverly had said. Actually, I know I'm right. Waverly had laughed, which was the thing about Olive. She made everything feel slightly more manageable, slightly more worth it. The cafe was called Groundwork. It was in Kitsilano, 2 blocks from the beach, and it smelled like espresso and cardamom and the particular kind of wood that gets warm in the afternoon sun. Waverly had opened it 4 years ago with the money she'd saved, the small inheritance from her grandmother, and a loan she'd spent 18 months paying off. It had been a terrifying, exhilarating, completely consuming experience, and she had never for one moment regretted it. She was good at what she did. She knew that. It was one of the few things she knew with real certainty. What she was less certain about lately was everything else. The morning after Callum's visit, her best friend Tara had come in for her usual oat latte and listened to the whole story with the particular expression she wore when she was trying to decide whether to say the thing she was actually thinking. Say it, Waverly told her. I wasn't going to say anything, Tara. Tara wrapped both hands around her cup. I just think it's interesting that out of everything, him coming back, the fiancé, all of it, what bothers you most is that she was carrying a coffee from somewhere else. Waverly considered this. It was a chain. I know. In my neighborhood. I know. That's a choice, Tara. It really is, Tara agreed. And then she was laughing, and then Waverly was laughing too. And that was also the thing about Tara. She had a way of making things smaller without making them feel dismissed. But the truth was, even after the laughter, something had stayed. Some small, uncomfortable thing that Waverly couldn't quite name. Not grief, exactly. Not jealousy. She didn't want Callum back, hadn't wanted him back in years. More like a recognition. A mirror held up at an unflattering angle. She was 34. She had a beautiful daughter and a thriving business and genuinely good coffee. She had a life she'd built herself, from scratch, because she'd had no choice but to build it. And yet, And yet she sometimes ate dinner standing over the sink because it felt pointless to set the table for one. And she sometimes lay awake at 2 a.m. not thinking about anything specific, just lying there with a low-level hum of something unfinished. And when Callum had walked in with his fiancée and his easy smile, some part of her had wondered, quietly and against her will, whether she was always going to be the person in the apron on the other side of the counter. She didn't like that part of herself, but it was there. The renovation was supposed to take 2 weeks. It had been a month since she'd hired a contractor to expand the back section of the cafe, knocking through to the space next door, adding 8 more tables, a small private room for events. It was the right call financially. She knew it was. But the construction had been chaos. The dust, the noise, the temporary wall that made the whole place feel cramped. The 3 separate times the project manager had called to tell her there was a small delay. The 3rd time, she'd asked very calmly to speak to whoever was actually in charge. That was how she met Stellan. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon, while Waverly's was in the middle of arguing with a supplier on the phone, and Olive was sitting at the corner table, doing homework and eating a brownie with the focused intensity of a child who knows they're getting away with something. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, because she noticed it practically before he'd cleared the doorway. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair going slightly gray at the temples and the kind of face that looked like it had been lived in and wasn't trying to hide it. He was wearing a jacket that was clearly expensive, though you had to know what to look for, and he had a way of standing in the middle of her chaotic cafe like he had no particular reason to be anywhere else. She held up one finger, "Give me a minute," and finished the call, which did not go especially well, and then she looked at him. "You're Waverly," he said. "Not a question. I am. And you're Stellan. I'm assuming I am." He looked around the cafe, at the temporary wall, the sawdust, the customers navigating around it with the mild irritation of people who have decided they love this place enough to put up with inconvenience. "I apologize for the timeline. I should have come in sooner." "You should have," she agreed. "But you're here now." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. He had dark eyes, she noticed, the kind that looked like they paid attention. They spent 40 minutes going over the project, standing at the counter with blueprints spread between them, Waverly asking questions, and Stellan answering them without hedging or explaining things to her like she wasn't capable of understanding the answers. She appreciated that. She'd had too many contractors over the years who'd adopted a particular tone with her, patient, slightly patronizing, as though running a business was somehow different when you were a woman who'd done it alone. Stellan didn't do that. He was direct, which she respected, and occasionally dry in a way that surprised her, and when Olive wandered over halfway through and inserted herself into the conversation with a question about whether the new walls would be earthquake-proof, he answered her with the same seriousness he'd been using with Waverly. "Structurally, yes," he said, "to a reasonable standard." Olive considered this. What's a reasonable standard? Good enough for Vancouver. Olive seemed to find this acceptable. She went back to her brownie. Waverly watched her go and then looked back at Stellan, who was watching Olive with an expression she couldn't quite read. "She's yours?" he asked. "She is." He nodded, like this was simply a thing that was true, and moved on. She found she liked that too. The renovation started actually moving after that. Whether it was because Stellan had taken a personal interest or because his team had simply needed someone to light a fire, Waverly didn't know, but the progress was suddenly visible. The wall coming down, the new framing going up, the shape of the expanded space beginning to emerge. He came by twice a week to check on things, sometimes more. He'd ask Waverly questions, defer to her on decisions she actually had opinions about, and make calls on the ones that were genuinely technical. He was efficient and precise and never stayed longer than necessary. But sometimes, when he'd finished his walkthrough and Waverly had handed him a coffee and they'd ended up sitting at the counter for 10 or 15 minutes, while the late afternoon light came through the front windows, it didn't feel like business at all. He didn't talk about himself easily. She picked up information in pieces, The way you learn a place by walking through it slowly. He'd grown up in Edmonton, moved to Vancouver in his late 20s. He had a sister he was close to. He read, though he didn't volunteer what. He'd been building things since he was old enough to follow his father around a job site, and he'd taken over the family company in his early 30s after his father got sick, and he'd run it since with the kind of quiet focus that made his employees, from what she could observe, simultaneously a little intimidated and very loyal. She learned these things without quite knowing when she'd started wanting to know them. Tara noticed. Of course Tara noticed. "You like him," she said, 7 minutes into one of her cafe visits. "He's my contractor, Waverly. He's a perfectly competent person I have a professional relationship with. You just described him for 4 minutes. I was giving context." Tara picked up her cup. Hughes described his hands. Waverly opened her mouth and then closed it. "You said they were," Tara made a show of remembering, "capable looking. That's a normal thing to observe about someone." "It is not," Tara said. "A normal thing to observe. It is a very specific thing to observe." Waverly went back to wiping down the counter. Her face felt warm, which was annoying. The truth was that she didn't know what to do with it. She was out of practice with this particular feeling, had been out of practice for years, and had mostly made her peace with that. She was good at the life she'd built. She didn't need to complicate it. She told herself this regularly. It didn't especially work. The week the renovation finished, Callum came back. Not to the cafe this time. She ran into him on the seawall on a Wednesday morning during the 45-minute window between dropping Olive at school and opening groundwork. She ran that loop 3 times a week because it was the only time that was genuinely hers, and she was annoyed to lose it to anything, let alone this. He was alone. No Brianna. He fell into step beside her in a way that she recognized. He'd always done that, always assumed he was welcome, and for a moment she just let him, too startled to do anything else. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "For which part?" "For coming in with Brianna." "That was, I don't know what I was thinking." "It's fine, Callum. It's not, actually." He paused. "You've done something really impressive with that place." "I didn't say that." She kept walking. The water was gray-green, and the mountains were doing the thing they did on clear mornings, sitting out there on the horizon like they were showing off. "Callum," she said, "what do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about us," he said, and there it was, the thing she'd been half expecting since he'd walked back into her city. "About what I threw away. I was young, and I was stupid, and You left," she said. "When Olive was 3 months old, you left. I know. So whatever you've been thinking, it doesn't matter. It's too late." She meant it. She felt it all the way through when she said it, the way she felt things that were actually true. There was no anger in it anymore, which surprised her a little, just a kind of finality, clear and clean as the morning air. He stopped walking. She kept going. She didn't look back. The opening party for the expanded cafe was Tara's idea, which meant it was actually a good idea, and Waverly had just needed someone to make it one. They put it together in a week. Strung lights across the new ceiling, borrowed a neighbor's speaker setup, made approximately 400 small things by hand, because Waverly had underestimated how much time hand-making things actually takes. Olive had strong opinions about the flower arrangement and was allowed to implement approximately 60% of them. Stellan showed up at 7, after most people had already arrived, and stood in the doorway of the expanded space for a long moment before finding Waverly at the bar. "You did something with the lighting," he said. "We did, yeah. It works." Coming from him, that was approximately the equivalent of someone else doing a standing ovation. She laughed, and he looked at her, and something in the air between them shifted in the way that things sometimes shift when you've been pretending something isn't there. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. Really. You drove the decisions. I just built what you asked for. That's not nothing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She poured him a coffee from the batch she'd been brewing specifically for the night. A single-origin Ethiopian, bright and complex. The kind of thing she'd been wanting to feature for months. He held the cup in both hands, which were objectively capable-looking, and he didn't make a show of drinking it the way some people did, the little performance of appreciation. He just tasted it, and was quiet for a moment. "This is excellent," he said. "I know," she said, and he almost smiled. They ended up talking for 2 hours, which was not something she'd planned and was definitely something Tara noticed and did not say anything about, which meant she was saving it for later. 3 days after the party, Waverly got a call from her accountant. She was alone in the cafe, the morning prep not yet started, and she sat down on a stool and listened while her accountant explained, carefully and in detail, what he'd found in the quarterly review. A supplier had been double billing for 8 months. Not her main supplier, a secondary one she'd trusted, hadn't checked carefully enough, because she'd been stretched thin and extending trust felt easier than auditing everything. The number was not catastrophic, but it was significant. It was the kind of significant that changed plans, that pushed timelines back, that made the comfortable margin she'd been carefully building suddenly feel much less comfortable. She sat with the phone in her hand for a while after the call ended. Olive wouldn't be up for another hour. The cafe was quiet around her, the morning light just starting to come through the windows, and she looked at the new walls, the ones Stellan had built, and felt the particular weight of being the only person who knew, right now, that something had gone wrong. That was the part nobody told you about doing it alone. It wasn't the big moments. It was the small ones, the Tuesday mornings, the phone calls you had to absorb by yourself with nobody to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. She called her accountant back with a list of questions. Then she made herself a coffee, not her usual, something stronger, and she sat down at the corner table, Olive's corner table, and she started working through the numbers herself. By the time she heard Olive's feet on the stairs, she had a plan. It wasn't elegant. It was going to require some renegotiating and some careful months, and probably saying no to a few things she'd been looking forward to. But it was a plan. "Morning, Mom," Olive said, wandering in with her hair still sleep-tangled, wearing the sweater she'd been living in all winter. "Morning, Bug." "You're up early." "I am." Olive climbed onto the stool beside her and looked at the papers spread across the table. "Is everything okay?" Waverly looked at her daughter, at her serious face, her borrowed eyes, her 6-year-old certainty that she was capable of handling real information. "Everything is going to be fine," Waverly said. "I'm just solving a problem." Olive nodded slowly. "Do you want help?" "I think I've got it. But thank you." "Actually," Olive said, reaching over to look at one of the pages upside down, "I'm pretty good at problems." "I know you are," Waverly said. "I wonder where you got that." She called the supplier that afternoon. The conversation was not pleasant. She had documentation, she had dates, she had the particular voice she used when she was done being reasonable, and had moved into the register where she was simply clear. The supplier offered to settle. She accepted what was fair and told him not to contact her again. Then she called Tara. "I'm proud of you," Tara said when she'd finished. "I haven't done anything. You did everything. You found it, you figured it out, you handled it. Waver, you always do this. You solve the whole problem and then you describe it like you barely participated." Waverly was quiet for a moment. "I'm tired," she said, "not as a complaint, just as a fact. I'm just a little tired." "I know," Tara said. "That's allowed." Stellan texted her that evening, something about a minor follow-up question on the renovation, something small. She answered it, and then without quite planning to, she typed, "Rough day. Nothing serious. How are you?" She stared at it for a second before she sent it, that small vulnerability sitting there on the screen. Then she sent it anyway. He replied within a minute, "Still at the office. What kind of rough day?" She smiled at her phone in the particular way she hadn't smiled at a phone in a long time. "Supplier drama," she wrote. "Handled now. But one of those days where you want to close everything down and just make something with your hands." "I know that feeling," he wrote back. And then, after a pause, "I make things with my hands every day. It doesn't actually help as much as people think." She laughed out loud, alone in her kitchen, Olive asleep upstairs. "Don't tell me that," she typed. "Fair enough. It helps a little." They texted for an hour. She didn't sleep badly that night. The dinner was his suggestion, though he framed it cautiously, the way she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of moving, forward but carefully, like someone who'd learned not to assume. "There's a place in Gastown I've been meaning to try," he said, during one of his check-in visits 2 weeks after the party. If you'd want to. She'd looked at him for a moment, making sure she was reading it right. She was. I'd want to, she said. It was a Thursday night. Tara had Olive. The restaurant was small and unhurried, with good wine and a menu that changed seasonally, and Stellan was different there than he was at the cafe, more open, somehow, less the person holding the clipboard and more just a person. He asked her questions and actually listened to the answers. He told her things she hadn't expected, about the year after his father died, about building the company back up from a period when it had nearly gone under, about his sister who lived in Halifax and called him every Sunday like she was checking his vital signs. She doesn't think you can take care of yourself, Waverly guessed. She has substantial evidence. What kind of evidence? He considered the question seriously. I owned a single plate for 3 years, one plate. I kept meaning to get more. How did you manage when people came over? He looked at her. Nobody came over. She laughed, and he watched her laugh with an expression that she felt all the way down. On the walk back to where they'd both parked, the night cold and clear, with the particular Vancouver winter cold that has teeth in it, he stopped at the corner and looked at her. I'd like to do this again, he said. So would I. He nodded once, like something had been settled. She didn't know, walking back to her car, how much had actually already been decided. She was starting to get a feeling, though, the same feeling she'd had about the cafe before she signed the lease, before she knew it was going to work. A feeling like, yes, this. Here. Callum texted her once more, a week later. A long message, more articulate than his usual, about choices and regrets and doors still open. She read it once. She replied, I hope you and Brianna are happy. I mean that. She didn't hear from him again. The morning the Vancouver magazine feature came out, a quarter-page piece on groundwork, the expansion, the story of how she'd built it. Olive sat at the counter and read the whole thing out loud, slowly and carefully, her little face very serious. It says you're a pioneer, Olive announced. That might be a bit much. Actually, Olive said, I think it's right. Waverly was behind the counter, pulling espresso shots, and she looked at her daughter, at this person she'd made, who thought dinosaurs were misunderstood and that her mother was a pioneer, and felt something settle in her chest. The cafe was full. The new space was full. The lights were warm and the coffee was good, and through the window she could see the street outside, gray and familiar in hers. Her phone buzzed. Stellan saw the article. You looked like you didn't expect it. She smiled. I didn't, she typed back. I built the thing for the thing, not for this. That's why it worked, he wrote. She set the phone down and pulled the next shot and thought about that. She'd spent a long time building something from nothing, for nobody but herself and Olive, with no plan except keep going. She hadn't been waiting for someone to walk in and change the story. She'd already changed it. She'd been in the middle of changing it for years without realizing that was what she was doing. Callum showing up with a ring on someone else's finger had felt, for about 20 minutes, like a verdict, like proof of something she'd been afraid of. But he'd just been a man in her cafe who'd ordered a coffee, and she'd been something much larger than anything he'd ever understood about her. She thought about Stellan's hands on the blueprints. She thought about Olive reading the word pioneer aloud with that careful, serious voice. She thought about Tara, who had known before Waverly knew. She thought about the night she'd signed the lease on this building, standing in an empty room that smelled like old carpet and possibility, and made herself a promise she hadn't put into words but had kept anyway. She'd built this, all of it, every single brick of it, her own. And now, standing in the warm middle of it with the morning rush in full swing and her daughter at the counter and her phone still warm in her apron pocket, Waverly Cole felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time, like everything was exactly right and she deserved it, and there was still so much more to come.